Well, welcome to another edition of Bill and Joe's TV, folks. Things haven't been going according to Plan A, or Plan B, or even Plan C. We've had a great many difficulties to overcome. How I personally used to do things a year ago, well, it just isn't working that way. You see, folks, one thing has never changed, and that is human nature. It's exactly the same today as it was some 6,000 years ago. Believe it or not, it's still true. What do change are conditions and circumstances, and they constantly change. In other words, what works today will not work tomorrow. That's how fast things are actually changing. And I just had to make a little adjustment here. I don't understand why my recording equipment is operating the way it does. Haven't figured that out. Spent days and days and days and days. Even spent a day down at the computer store. And the best we can come to, the best answer actually we can come to, is that something called artificial intelligence is now taking over. In other words, humans don't have to think anymore. There's a verse in the Bible that states, "Come, let us reason together, saith the Lord." Well, with artificial intelligence, we don't even have to do that anymore. And one of the mistakes that I made, and I'm guilty of it, is that for too many years I placed a lot of trust in the political system, the politicians, our alleged representatives, whether they be where I used to live or even here in the state of South Carolina or even out in the West Coast there, California. And that brings us to the purpose of this particular series that Joe and I have been attempting to put together about SCANA, South Carolina Electric and Gas. Folks, there is no easy answers, and actually there is really no simple answers when you get right down to what I call the bottom line. Some of what you hear and see today may be a little repetitious, but that's okay. That's a gimmick that the media likes to use today. In other words, repetition. Put it another way, you show something or you hear something long enough and people will eventually start to believe it. Well, that's exactly what's happened nowadays, folks, in the state of South Carolina with the SCANA and the South Carolina Electric and Gas issue that is allegedly being dealt with down in the South Carolina State House. So without any further ado, let's get into our presentation for today, folks. Okay, now if all goes well, which as of late, folks, to be quite honest, it really has been going all that great. But you should see a slide up on the screen there on the YouTube or whatever you're looking at this thing on, a lot of different ways. And it has a picture of Kevin Marsh and also an individual called Bernard Madoff. His most common name is Bernie Madoff, and that goes back many years. Now, Kevin Marsh, he's the SCANA CEO and a lot more. Now, back in the day, a few years back now, Bernie Madoff, he was in charge of investment securities, and he was ex-chairman, rather, of NASDAQ, and quite a few more things. He was running something that was called, I guess they called it a pyramid scheme. There was another name for it that slips my mind. But let's see what's going on today. Now, Kevin Marsh, he's still around. He's still active. And what he's doing right now, I really couldn't tell you, folks, because Mr. Joe Zinski, he's the one that's been doing the vast bulk of the research with regards to this investigation. I've kind of been working around the edges, per se. Like I said earlier, human nature hasn't changed, but conditions and circumstances do. Now, it's interesting to note that Bernie Madoff, there was a trial, and he actually went to jail, allegedly. Of course, I'm not there, you're not there, we don't know, except what we're told. He's in jail. Well, maybe he is, and maybe he ain't. That's the truth, folks. We really don't know. We can only go by what we're told and what we can actually see. And that jail verdict was handed down there in about 2009. Now let's look at the number of victims. That's a very interesting item. The victims that you see on the screen there is about 5 million victims. And that's probably, I'd say, just roughly in the state of South Carolina. But you see, the SCANA and South Carolina electric gas charade extends further out. It goes into North Carolina and Georgia. So there could be a lot more, there could be many more victims, rather, than what there was back in Bernie Madoff's day, back there in 2009. He only had 13,500 victims. Now, as we move along, there's a slide up there, known number of deaths. Well, I really don't know what Joe was trying to get at there, but let's look at it this way, okay? Kevin Marsh is still around, and from what I'm seeing here on the screen, Bernie Madoff has 2 sons. Now, again, human nature doesn't change, folks. Remember that. Human nature has remained the same for 6,000 years. I know you may find that hard to believe. You may find it hard to accept, but that is the truth, folks. Now, let's look at the scandal that was involved. Actually, Kevin Marsh, he's kind of getting right up there. The range of the scandal that he's involved in, that's called SCANA, South Carolina Electric and Gas. The VC Summer Nuclear Plant, I think, is another name for it. That could range anywhere from $2.2 to $20 billion. Now, Bernie Madoff, on the other hand, that ranged anywhere from $17 to $65 billion. So you could say what Kevin Marsh is involved in is chump change, or like old Nancy Pelosi said, well, $1,000 is just crumbs. That's all that is. Old Nancy Pelosi needs to get her head examined. Now, Kevin Marsh, he's walking around, as far as I know. He's a free man. No jail time, no appearances before a committee per se, just what's the investigations that have been going on down there in the House and the questionings and so forth and so on. But on the other hand, if you take a look there at Bernie Madoff there, he was investigated by the FBI. Well, that brings up another problem, folks. I'm sure some of you folks watch the news on the TV, and you can see all the nonsense that's going on with the FBI and the Clinton dossiers and the Trump haters. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. And quite honestly, folks, I'm getting fed up with it. You know, you keep investigating, but nobody's in jail. Now, I guarantee you, if somebody else did that, they'd be in jail. And in fact, the other day I saw a news report where President Trump pardoned a U.S. Navy guy that was taking pictures, and the story goes it was a 40-year-old submarine, and they court-martialed him and they locked him up and sent him to jail, and he just was pardoned by President Trump. Now, isn't it amazing that old Hillary Clinton and all of her cronies are still walking around on the streets, running their mouths, doing their thing? So here we go again. You know, we've got the same thing going on with the people that are part of SCANA. Because Kevin Marsh is not the only one, folks. There are others involved. And that also includes some of the politicians here in the state of South Carolina. Now, there's another little interesting fact up there. The amount of donations that were received from both of these alleged Well, see, only Kevin Marsh is alleged to be a criminal. Bernie Madoff, he was convicted of being a criminal. But what's interesting is the donations that come in from business. Now, there was over $1 million to over 1,000 public servants. In other words, by and large, that's politicians, folks, here in the state of South Carolina. And over $50 million on the Bernie Madoff side. Now, this brings up another interesting question. Remember the old cliche by Obama? Oh, the banks are too big to fail. Well, I kind of wonder about that. You know, the banks are too big to fail, so who bails them out? Well, the taxpayer bailed them out. Here's a news flash, folks. They keep jerking around like they are down there in Colombia, and you're going to wind up footing the bill for a plant that was abandoned. In other words, it's never going to be completed construction-wise. And the way they're looking at this thing, they want you to pay for that abandonment. Now, this goes into a whole nother issue, folks, and I've talked it over with Joe. Maybe we'll do a little more in-depth program on it. But, you know, you can get down to the regulatory commissions, that First Claims Act, that's FCA, I couldn't remember it the last time. And then you have the BLRA, the Base Load Review Act. That was all okayed by the politicians here in South Carolina, including the PSC, basically since about 2008. Now, on the other side of the card there was 8 reviews with regard to Bernie Madoff and his little scheme. And that ran from about 1992 to 2008. Now, there's another thing I mentioned previously, folks. I said I can trace some of this stuff back all the way to the late 1980s with myself. Not related to Scanner. But again, human nature does not change. The crooks were alive and well back there in the late 80s, and they're alive and well right here in 2018. Now, who's the beneficiary of all of this nonsense that's been going on? All of these scams, all of these swindles. Well, in this case, here in South Carolina, the beneficiaries of the criminal activity are going to be the scanner leaders. In other words, the corporate executives. On the other side of the card, it's Bernie Madoff. Well, his wife is going to be the beneficiary. How much money she'll wind up or eventually wind up with, I have no idea. Because once again, folks, the media is controlled. They only tell you what they want you to hear and know. They're not interested in the truth. That is the truth, folks. They're not interested in truth. And that's one of the reasons why Joe and I got together and tried to put together, I use the phrase Mickey Mouse report. In other words, it's really small and tiny compared to what the professionals can do. And that's why we've kind of put together this Mickey Mouse report here. Now, Kevin Marsh, he kind of seems like to be the leader of the pack per se, but I'm sure there's other people that are involved, people that are behind the scenes. And again, from what Joe's dug up, he seems to be the self-proclaimed God's man. In other words, he's going to solve the problem. Yeah, right. Now, on the screen there, folks, should be another slide, and you can check out information there, and also there's some links listed there, and chances are you're going to have to stop the video and copy and paste them. They may be live. I don't know, folks. I don't know, because what works today probably won't work tomorrow. And I'll give you a classic example. I like paper. Well, I went to print off some of this stuff rather than having to look at a computer screen, and now my printer don't work again. It worked fine 3 or 4 days ago, but all of a sudden, mysteriously, it doesn't work anymore. And that's not the only example. The same thing happens with the computer systems, with various Microsoft programs. And that's another issue that Joe and I had discussed a few days ago as to what's going on. Like I said, folks, I spent about 5 or 6 hours with a buddy of mine down at the computer store, And it's really amazing and interesting what we found out. But I would really suggest that you go, check out these links that are up here. There's 1, 2, I count, there's 4 links up there. And just check it out. You can also read online the state newspaper as well. There's some real good articles in there as well. And there's another paper. It's kind of a local one, I would say. It's called FITS News. That's FITS News, and you can find that online. And if my memory serves me right, you can also find them on Facebook. In other words, there's a lot of information that is out there, folks, that's done by other individuals. And here's the rub, folks. This is something I want to bring out and stress right now. This is really, really hard to do by just Joe and myself. In other words, we're only 2 people. And there's a lot of time that goes into trying to put all these programs together, digging up the research. And we could use some help. Now I'm going to wander off here a little bit, folks. But I've talked about religion before, and there's a difference. But this is a principle. Many hands make light work. And quite honestly, I'm down on the so-called evangelical Christian church. And I have very, very valid reasons why I'm down on it. And now that may upset a lot of folks. That's okay. Be upset. But if you pay attention, and you really pay attention, you'll begin to find out what I'm talking about. So, if you want to get involved, I know some people have got in touch with Joe. Get up with Joe. He's got a website set up, and he's ready to go. Okay, so sometimes it's a little hard to understand, but that's okay too, His heart's in the right place, and him and I have talked about this many, many hours on the telephone. And Joe's a real good person. But what makes Joe even a better person, is because he lived over in Poland when World War II started and after the Cold War. So he has a real-life basis of comparison compared to us spoiled Americans. And I'm including myself as well. I'm just as spoiled as the vast majority of people that are out there, folks. But just because we're spoiled, it doesn't mean that we should lay down and play dead for our local swamp, meaning that down there in Columbia, South Carolina. That's our local swamp. And we shouldn't have to lay down for the swamp that's in Washington, D.C. And that's what we've been doing for many, many years, folks. We've been laying down and playing dead. We've put trust in the politicians. And boy, that was a big mistake. And took me a lot of years to learn that, folks. You don't put trust in politicians. And you really better be careful when you put your confidence in the politicians' hands as well. Now, something else that I know, folks, is that people, as a general rule of thumb, they really get bored with anything that runs over, an hour. Nowadays, probably about 30 minutes. So, with that being said, Joe's the producer. In other words, he puts all these pieces together, and he puts it up there on YouTube and Facebook and wherever else he's putting it. But I ran across a song that, quite a few years ago, actually, folks. And now maybe Joe will leave it, stay in here. Maybe he won't. This is kind of a new wrinkle that I've added here on Bill and Joe's TV, per se. But I really want you to give a listen to this song, folks, because it really, really has a message. I don't know who recorded it. It's just an individual. He's probably a nobody like I am and like Joe are, and like the vast majority of you folks that listen to this program. But pay attention to the words, folks. It's really, really good. At least I think it is. So give a listen and pay close attention, folks.
When did the church become a business, and the calling on our lives become a job? When did the Lord become our servant, rather than us giving service to our God. When did our words become so empty? It must have been when our opinions took His place. When did our prayers become so selfish? When it became only for our own gain, we chose to seek His face. And you can say what you want to, but it's better to give than to receive. Our self-centered lip service won't do a thing for their unbelief. Go on and preach prosperity, but you're missing the point, my brother. The gospel is not financial gain, but it's meant to be shared for free with one another and free for all the world. Jesus is free for all the world. When did our pockets make the difference? And the pockets in the front pew make the team? When did we first become so prideful? Oh, I'm just a man, so please don't idolize me. When did the devil take his seat in the congregation? When we lifted holy hands as to catch our brother's eye. Why has the church been starving so long? We're scratching itching ears and our focus is on the tide. And you can say what you want to, but it's better to give than to receive. Our self-centered lip service won't do a thing for their unbelief. So go on and preach prosperity, but you're missing the point, my brother. The gospel is not financial gain, but it's meant to be shared for free with one another and free for all the world. Jesus is free for all the world.